I mean, I just admire what a history of involvement you've had over the past 50 years. It's just incredible. So hugely inspirational character to me. Um, and if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to when you first arrived in the UK, which I believe was 1971, kind of a couple of years after the Wolfenden Report, legalization of homosexuality in the UK, a couple of years after Stonewall. What was it like to be a gay man in the UK at that time?
Can I just be absolutely clear? It was a partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality in 1967.
Sure, thank you.
And in fact, the number of arrests for consenting adult same-sex behaviour increased by 400% in the few years after 1967.
Wow, I wasn't aware of that. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for clearing that up.
And full decriminalisation didn't happen in England and Wales until 2003, not in Northern Ireland until 2009, and not in Scotland until 2013.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, we just assumed that it was the Wolfenden Report that kind of legalized everything, really. So, yeah, thank you for clearing that up. Well, what was it like to be a gay man in those days in the UK?
Well, most aspects of gay male life were still criminalised, despite the partial decriminalisation of 1967. So sex was only lawful if it took place between two consenting adult civilians, aged 21 or over, in the privacy of their own home, with doors and windows locked and closed, and with no other person present in any part of the house. It remained illegal in Northern Ireland until 1982, and in Scotland until 1980. It remained unlawful in the armed forces until 1994, and unlawful in the Merchant Navy until 2 years ago.
Wow, so you were very aware then at that time that the battle hadn't been won. There was still a lot to fight for. What were your priorities at that time?
Can I just add that
of course.
At that time there were no public figures who are openly LGBT plus. The only time LGBT plus people were ever mentioned was when they were exposed as spies, child sex abusers, or mass murderers.
Yeah.
You know, the medical and psychiatric professions still designated homosexuality as an illness and supported various cures, including electric shock aversion therapy, funded by the taxpayer on the National Health Service.
Wow, that's incredible. So there's still an incredibly hostile narrative towards the LGBTQ community, or I guess that wasn't even a term back then. Yeah. So as I say, what were your priorities then at that time as an activist?
Well, I was very quickly involved in the newly formed Gay Liberation Front in London. And our agenda was really to take on the establishment over its homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So this included campaigns for an equal age of consent, because the age of consent for heterosexuals was 16, whereas for gay and bisexual men it was 21, a 5-year difference, which criminalized both young men under 21 but over 16, and also their partners of whatever age.
Yeah.
We also had campaigns against the medical and psychiatric professions, and did zaps of Harley Street against well-known psychoanalysts and psychiatrists who were advocating the curing of homosexuality. I staged a protest at St Thomas's Hospital in London during a lecture by Professor Hans Eysenck, who was then one of the world's most famous psychologists. He was justifying the use of electric shock aversion therapy, and I was dragged out of the meeting and beaten up by doctors and medical students.
Wow.
The Gay Liberation Front also did big protests against Festival of Light, which was a Christian-led morality campaign targeting abortion, pornography, and homosexuality. The leading lights of that campaign were very hostile to LGBT plus rights. So, among other things, we invaded their launch meeting at Westminster Central Hall and disrupted it with nuns in drag. We released mice into the audience, and others of us stood up and did same-sex kisses.
Fantastic. So many, like so many of your forms of protest, they just demonstrating incredible courage and bravery, but also theatrics as well, which I think is a particular kind of phenomenon in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
And you mentioned zapping, which of course started over here in the US at that time. What impact would you say that Stonewall had on the gay community in the UK around that time?
Well, I think people heard about the Stonewall riots and subsequent gay liberation protests in New York and other cities. And that was partly the inspiration for the formation of the Gay Liberation Front here. In fact, two young students, Bob Mellors and Aubrey Walter, went to the United States in, I think it was the summer of 1970 or maybe 71, I think it was 70, and had met up with an experienced Gay Liberation Front protest in New York. They also attended the Black Panthers Revolutionary People's Convention in Philadelphia, where Huey Newton, the then leader of the Black Panthers, welcomed LGBT plus people into the liberation struggle. So they returned to Britain inspired by those experiences, and they were the ones who called the first meeting of what was to become the Gay Liberation Front in London at the London School of Economics on the 13th of October, 1970.
And I guess the whole Pride movement sprang out of that as well in subsequent years.
That's right. I mean, the Gay Liberation Front took the initiative in organising Britain's first ever Pride Parade, which took place in London on the 1st of July, 1972. I was one of about 30 people involved in organising and publicising the Pride event. We had no idea what to expect because in those days, most LGBT plus people were closeted. They wouldn't dare show their faces. So we were fairly pleasantly surprised when about 700 to 1,000 people turned out.
Wow.
And we rallied in Trafalgar Square and then marched to Hyde Park, where we had a gay day. I've got to say that and the gay day involved, a picnic in the park, basically, and playing various queer versions of traditional party games like oranges and lemons, spin the bottle, and so on. I've got to say that the police presence was very heavy, extraordinarily heavy. There's almost one police officer for every marcher.
Wow.
And some of the officers, not all of them, but some of them, hemmed us in and shoved us and, openly abused us as, queers and faggots and dykes.
That's incredible. What was the response from people in the streets in general? Was there much support as you were marching?
It was interesting. About 1/3 of the public were clearly hostile. They shouted abuse, some even threw cans and coins.
Wow.
About 1/3 were sort of just, I suppose, disbelieving and gulping. They couldn't believe that gay people would dare show their faces. The other 1/3 were actually quite supportive. So we had cheers and applause as well. It wasn't all negative.
That's interesting.
And that gave us great hope.
Yeah.
We were pleasantly surprised. We hadn't expected that about 1/3 of the public on the route would give us support. So that gave us the confidence to keep fighting.
That's really interesting. We were looking at the Anita Bryant movements in Miami, and that obviously later in the decade. But she hailed her overwhelming victory as being 2-1. But we kind of discussed that in class to say that from really having no visibility and no public figures, like you say, no real kind of organized campaigns, for there to be a 1/3 base of people who are largely sympathetic towards gay rights can be seen as an encouraging place to start. So it's interesting that you mentioned that same figure, really.
I think it's probably down to the fact that the late 60s, early 70s were a period of radical ideas and radical movements across the board. And it was the opening up of Britain to liberal progressive ideals.
Yeah.
So the gay liberation movement sort of fitted into that.
Yeah, of course. And what would you say would be the legacy of Stonewall for the gay community in the UK?
I think the Stonewall legacy is actually quite limited. It was something that happened in the United States.
Yeah.
We acknowledged it, we appreciated it, but really we were determined to chart our own course based upon our own circumstances, history, and traditions.
Yeah, and forms of oppression, I guess, as well, which, if you don't mind, we'll come on to later, to things like Section 28. I'm going to move forward because I'm very aware of the time, but just to move, if you don't mind, just to jump forward to the 1980s, which, of course, were dominated by the AIDS crisis. How did that emerge to you as somebody who lived through it?
Well, of course, the first we heard was in late 1981, early 1982, that gay men were dying of some new mysterious disease. And there was very little knowledge or awareness. We very much looked to the US, where these cases have been reported, for a lead. So the gay press here, Capital Gay and Gay Times, Him magazine, really took the lead in publicizing what information was available. And of course, when the first person died of HIV in Britain in 1982, that led to the formation of the Terence Higgins Trust, which is still is to this day, the main HIV charity in Britain.
Yeah.
We were very, very conscious of two things. First of all, the need to inform and educate our community. And initially, the advice was, don't have sex with Americans. And myself and others knew that was not an adequate response. Almost certainly, the virus was present in Britain by the time we became aware of it, and that we had to think about, what other measures could be taken to protect oneself. So the obvious thing was to use condoms, and there was quite a lot of resistance within the gay male community to condom use. They regarded many people regard it as a spoiler. You're spoiling our fun. But of course, eventually, as sexual transmission became verified by scientific medical research, then of course that eventually became the norm.
Yeah.
But overall, the situation was very frightening. First of all, we were dealing with a new, largely unknown disease. Secondly, we had a government of Margaret Thatcher that was indifferent to it. And third, we had a huge public hysteria and panic, which resulted in AIDS being dubbed, quote, the gay plague, and a huge escalation in threats, abuse, and violence against LGBT plus people, even against lesbians who were not affected by HIV.
Yeah. I remember some of the campaigns for the use of condoms being pretty graphic at times, but also really humorous at times as well. It was that dual combination of humor and kind of like quite brutal way of trying to get the message across to the community. You mentioned the Thatcher indifference by the Thatcher administration. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is it indifference, or were they more overtly opposed to taking action?
Well, basically, until the first heterosexual person died of AIDS, the UK government did nothing. As long as just gay and bisexual men were dying, they looked the other way. Yeah. So the Terence Higgins Trust really struggled to get even meager funding. I think eventually they got something like £35,000, which was a drop in the ocean, insignificant. So we felt that this was clearly a government that was not recognizing the medical emergency that was looming, and which was allowing its judgment to be clouded by rank homophobia. This was a time, of course, when the Thatcher government had two consecutive campaigns. The first one was for a return to Victorian values, and the second one was for family values. And in both those campaigns, there was no place and no recognition of LGBT plus people.
Yeah.
Then on top of that, we did have, in the later 80s, a Section 28. But even before Section 28, the Conservative government had used homophobia as a political weapon against the Labour Party, particularly against Labour-controlled local municipalities who had often given support to LGBT plus communities and to HIV organisations. The Thatcher government suggested that they were wasting taxpayers' money, that they were funding perversion, etc., etc. That was really, really difficult. It meant that in many parts of the country there was little or no local support for LGBT plus communities or people affected by HIV/AIDS. When, of course, Section 28 came along, it was the first new anti-gay law in Britain for a century. And as you know, it prohibited the promotion or the so-called promotion of homosexuality or the promotion of same-sex relationships as, quote, pretended family relationships. This led to a huge mass of censorship, mostly by local councils and education authorities, but also by some other bodies like local health authorities. They did not provide the support they should have, and what support they had given was hastily withdrawn. It led to gay-themed plays being withdrawn from schools, gay-themed books being taken off library shelves. It led to violent attacks upon theatres that were independent and were performing gay-themed plays. It was a very, very hostile and quite violent time. Coinciding, the number of gay and bisexual men arrested for consenting adult same-sex behaviour rocketed, so that by 1989, the level of convictions for these entirely consensual offences was almost as great as in 1954-55. Oh, sorry, I'll rephrase that. The level of arrest for the main anti-gay offence of gross indecency, the law that sent Oscar Wilde to prison in 1895, and which resulted in Alan Turing being subjected to chemical castration in the 1950s. That law, the number of convictions under that law rocketed to almost as great as in the period 1954-55, when male homosexuality was totally illegal and when the country was gripped by an anti-gay witch hunt. Simultaneously, the number of gay and bisexual men who are being murdered escalated dramatically. Between 1986 and 1991, I identified 51 murders of men where the circumstances pointed to a homophobic motive. And that is just the cases, the murders that were drawn to my attention. I'm sure the real figure was even higher.
Yeah.
It was on a level with race attacks and race murders.
Wow.
But it was almost unreported, and there was no, the police were the perpetrators, not the protectors.
That's incredible. Do you think that, as sometimes happen when particular acts of oppression are applied, that in some respects it serves to galvanize the community a little bit more? I know that in 1990, I believe you were instrumental in the forming of Outrage. Do you see that as emerging from that situation?
Well, the formation of Stonewall, the parliamentary lobby group, and Outrage, the direct action protest group, were direct consequences of this escalating homophobic atmosphere. Primarily, but not exclusively, Section 28 in the case of Stonewall, and in the case of Outrage, the twin disparities between escalating police arrests of gay and bisexual men and the failure to prosecute and properly investigate the murders of gay and bisexual men.
Yeah, and I believe that Outrage was initiated a dialogue with the police at that time to try to change policing methods towards the gay community. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we very much issued an ultimatum to the police. We want protection, not persecution.
Right.
And we mounted a series of very high-profile public protests against police harassment, including the use of agents provocateurs. These were young, attractive officers who dressed up in a gay style, then went into a public toilet or a park or cruising area, would give gay men the come on, and any man who then responded would be arrested. This is clearly police collusion or police, encouragement of the commission of crimes. So we did a number of things, including picketing police stations, invading police stations, interrupting police press conferences, photographing police agents provocateurs and putting their pictures in toilet doors and on toilet cubicle doors, and on stapling them on trees in parks where they were active. We were very much about taking on the police and exposing what we said was a misuse of police resources and public money. We said police should be concentrating their efforts on combating real criminals who cause people harm, not going after victimless crimes involving gay and bisexual men.
Yeah. And could you feel public opinion swinging the way of the gay community through this process as well?
It did. I mean, Outrage had a very sophisticated campaign. We really professionalized protest, producing very slick news releases, which were very authoritative, which quoted the exact law, gave examples of individuals who were victims, offered them to the media to be interviewed. Journalists really, praised us at the time, saying that, we were incredibly efficient, effective, and professional. And that gave them the confidence to take our news releases and report them, because they knew that we could be relied upon in terms of accuracy and honesty. So we got masses of media coverage in the press and on radio and TV. Myself and other Outrage spokespeople would be on TV news programs, discussion programs, radio talkback programs, etc., day after day after day. And through this process, we were able to change hearts and minds. And this was a very clearly well thought out strategy. It wasn't an accident. Our strategy was we needed to do imaginative, creative, exciting, daring, provocative protests that would get media coverage. And through that media coverage, we would raise public awareness about the scale of anti-LGBT plus discrimination and violence. And off the back of that, we would get invited onto chat shows and phone-in programs where we could further amplify the issues and cause that we were fighting. So this was the thought-out strategy of how we would change hearts and minds, how we would reach the public and then convince them that the law needed to change.
Yeah. And what about the drive to encourage people to come out as well? Was that an effective strategy?
Yes, although I wouldn't say that by this stage, by the late 80s, early 90s, the coming out strategy was really more from the 70s and 80s.
Earlier on.
Yeah. We assumed by the 80s and 90s that, those who were willing to come out would come out.
Right.
And when they witnessed the scale of victimization that our community was facing, they would come out themselves. They wouldn't need to be asked.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks. Well, you mentioned some of the more spectacular stunts that you arranged with Outrage. Can you talk to us a little bit more about some of them? I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the Easter address by George Kerry, which made certainly national news in the UK. Your attempts to arrest Robert Mugabe, of course, not necessarily LGBTQ related, but another example of the kind of direct action that you took, incredibly courageous, incredibly brave, but that made national and international news. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Well, I think early on, some of the spectacular outrage protests included the kiss-in in Piccadilly Circus, which was to challenge the way that even in the early 1990s, the police were arresting and securing the conviction of same-sex couples for simply kissing and holding hands or expressing affection in public. So, for example, there was a famous case of two lesbians at a railway station who were arrested for giving each other a goodnight kiss as one got on the train. So we decided to defy the law, and we issued a challenge. We're holding this mass kiss-in. Come to Piccadilly Circus and arrest us all if you believe this law is worth defending. And of course, having in the weeks prior, put up to the media examples of same-sex couples who had been arrested for kissing, holding hands, hugging in public, this already built a huge momentum of public outrage, because even people who didn't agree with homosexuality thought this was pretty excessive. To give someone a criminal conviction for simply kissing, at a bus stop, or something like that was deemed to be so over the top. So come the night of the kiss-in, an hour beforehand, the police announced that henceforth in London, they would not arrest any same-sex couple for merely expressing public affection.
Wow.
In other words, we won before the kiss-in even began. It turned into a huge celebration instead. Another example was we organized a turn-in at Bow Street Police Station, the police station where Oscar Wilde was taken when he was arrested in 1895. We signed statements and then turned ourselves into the police at Bow Street Police Station, for example, saying that we'd had sex before the lawful age of consent of 21, that we'd had sex with more than two people, we had sex with other people present in the house, etc., etc. The statements were taken, but then no one was ever prosecuted. Clearly the police realized that this was not in the public interest and that the law was an ass.
Yeah.
Another example was the naming of the 10 Anglican bishops in 1994, where we called on them to tell the truth. They weren't being targeted because they were in the closet. It was because they were colluding with a church that was seriously homophobic. The Church of England not only said that homosexuality was sinful and that gay people must repent, it also said that the criminal law and the civil law should discriminate against LGBT plus people because we were, quote, inferior.
Wow.
So we named these 10 Anglican bishops on the steps of the General Synod of the Church of England, which is the Church of England's parliament, and called on them to tell the truth. They were telling us to tell the truth. They were saying, you should always tell the truth, but they weren't telling the truth about their own sexuality. Again, a huge positive impact. As far as I know, none of those bishops ever again, said anything anti-LGBT. Some of them actually eventually came out in support of our community. The church was so embarrassed that it organized for a senior bishop to begin the first ever liaison with the LGBT plus community. And soon afterwards, the House of Bishops issued a very strong declaration against homophobic discrimination. Now, I don't think any of those things would have happened if we hadn't been challenging and provocative by naming those bishops.
Yeah, so you were achieving real tangible successes.
And then the case you mentioned of the protest in Canterbury Cathedral on Easter Sunday in 1998, we, that is members, I think 7 members of Outrage, we walked into the pulpit of the then Archbishop of Canterbury to condemn him for saying that gay people were inferior and that the law should discriminate against us. He was lobbying Parliament to oppose an equal age consent, to oppose legal recognition of same-sex relationships, to support the idea that employers should in certain circumstances be allowed to discriminate against LGBT plus staff, and so on and so on. We did not interrupt the sacred parts of the service. We waited until he began his sermon. And then we went into the pulpit peacefully, non-violently, and I, as the lead person, publicly criticized the Archbishop, saying that discrimination was not a Christian value. We were arrested. I was eventually charged under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551, which says that any interruption of a minister of religion in a church is, quote, indecent behaviour. And I was duly convicted. I could have been fined £5,000 and sent to prison for 6 months. The magistrate decided the punishment should be a fine of £18.60. His comical reference to the 1860 Act, under which I'd been convicted.
That's incredible. So at least it demonstrated the sympathy of the magistrate, I guess, to your cause at that time, and then how ridiculous it was to use that measure against you.
That's right. And again, the positive upshot was that we only did that protest because the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, who was the then Archbishop, he refused to meet anyone from the LGBT plus community. He wouldn't even meet the lesbian and gay Christian movement, many of whose members belonged to his own Anglican church. So when he wouldn't meet us, that's why we went to him, to Canterbury. And as a result of that protest, we made the point that we and others had tried for 8 years to meet him. He'd refused. Then he was so embarrassed by that he did agree to meet the lesbian and gay Christian movements shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
And again, I wouldn't say he's completely stopped his lobbying against gay equality, but he certainly dramatically reduced it.
Yeah, great.
And, what we did prompted some bishops to speak out in favor of LGBT plus equality.
Yeah. Did you find, or do you think that it's important that, or significant that some of your maybe more controversial acts possibly caused a backlash against what you were trying to achieve?
Well, yes, of course. Backlash is part of the process of social progress.
Yeah.
The Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States led to a backlash. In the Deep South, the number of lynchings of Black people continued, or in some areas even increased. No one wants that. And we didn't want a backlash against the LGBT plus community, but we knew we had to take a stand. We had to challenge this homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And if that meant a backlash, so be it. But we knew the backlash would be temporary. Right. We knew that we would get through it and emerge in the long run stronger and with greater rights.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, just in relation to direct action, as I remember very well that you stood as a member of Parliament in Bermondsey in the 80s, at the 83 election,
yeah.
The Michael Foot election.
And no, it was a by-election.
Oh, was it a by-election? Okay.
But also in 83.
Was it also in 83? How do you see that balance between direct action on the one hand and mainstream political action on the other, or do you see them as intrinsically linked?
Well, I always take the example of the suffragists and the suffragettes. In the battle for votes for women, there were the suffragists who worked within the parliamentary system to lobby government and to lobby MPs. They did things by the rules, but they didn't make much progress. So we had the suffragettes who did direct action to shake up the establishment, to put the struggle for women's votes in the news. And so that's the way I've seen the LGBT plus struggle as well. I was not against Stonewall and their parliamentary lobbying, but largely they did not get anywhere. It was only when outrage came along and began to shake things up that things began to change.
Yeah.
It was a bit like good cop, bad cop. Outrage created the outrage that led to people in power thinking we've got to do something. So rather than deal with the nasty outrage people, they went to Stonewall.
Right.
And of course, Stonewall pushed the agenda forward in more orthodox and discreet ways.
Yeah.
But I think you need both.
Yeah.
And outrage did in fact do both. We did lobby members of parliament and police chief constables and judges and church leaders. We tried the lobbying and sometimes it worked, but mostly it didn't. It was only the direct action that really got results. So I'm not one who says there's only one way to do it. There are many different ways, and all those different ways help. The other thing I'd say is that Stonewall had a very much an equal rights agenda, but purely equal rights. It just wanted equality within the status quo, whereas Outrage, like the Gay Liberation Front earlier, was much more critical of the social mainstream. You know, we had a much more skeptical view towards the laws, institutions, and values of mainstream society. We didn't want equality within an unjust system. We wanted equality that went beyond what was to what could be and should be. So, for example, on the issue of sex education in schools, Stonewall was very much about just getting LGBT issues included within the curriculum. Outrage was saying, look, the curriculum is rubbish when it comes to sex and relationship education for straight kids. We don't want that. We want a better sex education for all kids, whatever their sexuality, whatever their gender identity. Likewise, with regard to marriage, you know, of course, Outrage opposed the ban on same-sex marriage because it was driven by homophobia, and we as an organization were against homophobia. But we never thought that marriage was the be-all and end-all. So we shared the feminist critique of marriage. So we were in a curious position of both opposing the ban on same-sex marriage, but also arguing for something better. So we came up with the idea of what was initially called an Unmarried Partners Act and later called a Civil Commitment Pact, which would give legal rights in a different framework for marriage or what came to be civil partnerships. I mean, basically civil partnerships are marriage by another name. You know, some of the terminology is different, but the essence, the model is the same. And whereas Stonewall just wanted civil partnerships and marriage, Outrage said, well, yes, but we want something bigger and better. You know, in modern societies, you know, the marriage model, the civil partnership model doesn't really, you know, hack it. You know, both those are one size fits all. Whereas in modern societies, there's a huge diversity of modern relationships. You know, some partners live together, others live apart. Some have share their finances, others maintain financial independence. Some have kids, others don't. So we need a system that can allow a couple to create their own tailor-made partnership agreement suited to their own particular circumstances. So that's the way, another example of how Outrage differed from Stonewall. We had a sort of equality plus agenda, you know, arguing that we don't want equality within an unjust status quo.
That's, I mean, and that debate's still very much ongoing, isn't it, between those who are advocating for, if you like, a place at the table, and those who want to tear the table down and have, you know, established what might be called as queer spaces that don't conform to the system. So yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. So thank you for that really comprehensive answer. The only thing I would follow up on that is, did that leave for an uncomfortable relationship at times between Stonewall and Outrage?
Well, basically, Outrage was very happy to work alongside Stonewall, and we appreciated their work. But Stonewall did not reciprocate. And they very much portrayed themselves as the LGBT plus organization and really excluded all other organizations, not just Outrage, but the Lesbian and Gay Christian movement, Lesbian and Gay Employment Rights, Gallup, the gay policing group. They were all marginalized by Stonewall. They seem to have a sort of empire building mentality, which didn't fit very well with our more inclusive, diverse approach of collaboration.
And do you think Stonewall's priorities have changed, because they are still campaigning and advocating for LGBTQ plus rights? Do you think their priorities have changed now?
Well, no, they're pretty much the same. The only thing that has happened is at last, recently, they did embrace trans rights, which they'd always refused. And, you know, that's good. But it's all still within the very narrow confines of equality with the laws that exist, rather than any questioning of those laws or any alternative models.
Can I just take you back briefly to when you were campaigning, when you were standing for Parliament? I remember vividly as well the kind of homophobic attacks that were thrown against you by mainly by the Liberals, if I remember correctly, which really surprised me. How did that feel at the time when you were standing for liberation and you were standing to represent the gay community, to feel that level of attack from the political system?
Well, of course, I was standing as a left-wing Labour candidate who supported LGBT plus rights. And I think that my manifesto for LGBT plus rights that I enunciated in that period, I think it's more radical than anybody has ever advocated before or since. It was a very, very detailed manifesto. No disrespect to others who went before and have come since, but it was far-reaching, but I think, very much within the mainstream of, liberal human rights values.
Yeah.
It's true that I think Gay News described what happened to me as the most sustained vilification of a gay person since Oscar Wilde. Lots of media commentators and journalists described the Bermondsey by-election as the dirtiest, most violent, and definitely most homophobic election in Britain since the Second World War. I was subjected to almost non-stop smears, attacks, and vilification by the tabloid press. There were about 50 attacks upon my flat, including bricks and bottles through the window, even a bullet through the front door, and an arson attempt. I was also physically assaulted over 150 times while out canvassing on the doorsteps.
Wow.
So it was very, very tough and very, very frightening.
Yeah.
But I was very determined. I felt I was fighting a just cause. And what's interesting is that all the issues that I was denounced for as an extremist are now the mainstream. Yes. So I argued for troops out of Ireland and a negotiated political settlement in the north. That happened, almost 2 decades later. I argued for a national minimum wage, which I was told was extremist and would bankrupt the country. We've had a national minimum wage for well over a decade now, and the economy is running fine. I argued in favour of a comprehensive non-discrimination act to protect everyone against discrimination. That too was denounced as extremist, but it has been, part of British legal fabric, part of the British legal fabric since 2010. Some quite long time after I advocated it, but it is nice to know that so-called extremist policies that I advocated are now part of the mainstream, and that I think shows how Britain has changed politically, legally, and culturally.
Yeah. You mentioned the Equality Act of 2010. This will be my last question, if you like, because I'm aware of the time that's running by. And if I may also kind of mention marriage equality in the UK, both as being huge steps forward, I guess. But what do you see as the remaining challenges, and perhaps the most immediate challenge for the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, there are a number. First of all, we do need to secure reform of the Gender Recognition Act to allow trans people to self-identify through a statutory declaration. It exists in quite a number of other countries successfully without a problem. It's quite wrong that trans people have to go through so many hoops and hurdles to now get a legal recognition of their status. So that needs to change. We need to secure the outlawing of LGBT plus conversion therapy. This was promised by the Conservative government in July 2018, and it still hasn't happened. It exists already in many other countries and states. The Australian state of Victoria only just recently introduced probably one of the world's best legislations to outlaw so-called LGBT plus conversion therapy. It's the model, it's the template. The British government could easily adapt it and legislate it, but it's refusing. We're pressing for compensation for gay and bisexual men who were convicted and either fined or imprisoned under historic anti-gay laws. Many of them suffered terribly, not only imprisonment, but also beatings and abuse and threats and menaces within prison, sometimes by other inmates and sometimes even by prison staff. Those who weren't in prison were often whacked with huge fines, which caused them financial hardship. And many of these men eventually lost their jobs, their homes, their marriages. Some ended up, or many ended up, anxious, depressed, and even suicidal. So we think it's right that these men should be compensated for the suffering they endured. But again, the Conservative government has stonewalled. They say they're considering it, but that's what they said 2 or 3 years ago, and there's still no progress. We also need to end the way in which the Home Office treats LGBT plus refugees fleeing persecution in countries abroad. At the moment, they are liable to be incarcerated in asylum detention centres, which are essentially prisons by another name. If they're not incarcerated, they're banned from working and are forced to live in often substandard Home Office hostels, often sharing accommodation with homophobic refugees who abuse them. And they have to live on a meagre state stipend of less than £40 a week for food, for clothing, travel, phones, etc. It's impossible. And it's causing great hardship. We also need to amend the Equalities Acts, the various Equalities Acts, which give some exemptions for religious organizations, not only religious places of worship, but also faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, shelters for the homeless, and so on. Under the law, they are exempt in certain circumstances from ensuring equality and non-discrimination. And we think that, that's just untenable. Why should religious bodies be above laws that apply to everyone else? And finally, what's the final one? There's one more. Oh yes, the government finally was persuaded to introduce mandatory LGBT plus inclusive relationship and sex education in schools. It was due to come in September 2019, but was postponed to September 2020. Then along came COVID, and now it's been postponed till September 2021. The principle is good, but the content of LGBT plus education is not specified. So it means that it basically gives schools a free hand. Some can do it well, some can basically get around it by doing a minimal tokenistic LGBT plus education. There's also the problem that faith schools are going to be allowed to continue to promote their own religious ethos, which in many cases says that homosexuality is and transgenderism are, sinful, immoral, abnormal, and unnatural. So we really have to close those loopholes. So there is still work to be done.
Yeah. You must be, well, I'm assuming though that you must be optimistic about the possibility of achieving these changes. Throughout your long career as an activist, you've seen a lot of changes, a lot of progress, sometimes 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. But do you remain optimistic about the possibilities of achieving full equality?
Oh, absolutely. I am an eternal optimist by nature. I'm an idealist, driven by a vision of what could be rather than what is. And I, over the years, have seen so many things that seemed impossible come to fruition. Even just 20 or so years ago, the idea of same-sex marriage to most people seemed impossible. Myself and Outrage, we began campaigning for it in 1992, and we were dismissed even by most LGBT plus people. Stonewall actually opposed same-sex marriage right up until about 2011, 2012. But we had this vision and we stuck to it, and eventually, with many others, of course, we prevailed.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. You know, before today's interview, I was reading through your website, and I was just so inspired by some of your quotes that you've put up on your About section. And I recommend your website to anyone who's interested in human rights activism, LGBTQ activism, maybe in particular. And you know, to be honest, they all just made me fall in love with you a little bit more. So,
well, thank you very much, David. I appreciate your kind words. That's very, very generous of you.
No, I'm incredibly grateful to you for, as I said, all that you've done for our community and all that you continue to do. And I'm incredibly grateful for you to giving up your time today. Thank you so much, Peter, and I wish you all the best.
Okay, well, good luck with it, and maybe send me a copy when you produce it, if you're able to do that. It'd be good to read it. Yeah,
we'll do. Absolutely. Thank you so much.